It's recording.
Right.
Okay, so we're on recording now, so we'll start formally then.
Okay, Arusha. So is there a first I've sent in?
Yes, and it is, are there any plans to QA the occupation information in the NIESR, ASHE, or RED projects, and to link in the occupations and the NIESR data from the censuses?
Okay, so to some extent there is QAing the occupation information because we know that there are discontinuities in the data when, for example, the automatic coding of occupations was introduced. We don't know exactly, or we don't know yet exactly what the impact of that automatic coding has been on the microdata. So ONS has, I think some researchers have reported that there is a change, but what we haven't been able to do yet is to quantify that. And then in terms of the census data, well, I suppose there is an option to QA and compare the results, although one of the matches that we'll be looking at matching on occupation. I believe that's right, Phan?
Yeah.
So there is the one stage census matching involving names things. There's a second census matching about industry and occupation and location. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. But on the matching not using occupations, then I guess there is potential in there to compare the two. So, any other thoughts?
I think it's on. Hopefully, it's on the action plan then to do some QAing on the occupational coding over time. So, when are these moments when the methodology changed?
Yeah.
And how does occupation feature when we try and identify the same job over time within the individual versus a switch in job? The other thing, of course, that changes is the occupational classification itself. And as we know, that does require some rejigging of where a person is sometimes. When either an occupational code sort of gets less specific or more specific. I think a case I remember that Lucy and I used to discuss was identification of head teachers later on as opposed to teachers or something.
Yeah, possibly. I think there's a few things like that, aren't there, that we might need to watch out for.
Okay. Yes, and the trouble is the automatic coding comes in, I think, around 2007, 2008. Is that right? And then so that's just before the switch to SIC 2010. So there's a number of jumps in there. But yeah, actually, one thing we should look at will be they've got the same job marker in the data. Now, we always understood that as if someone ticks this on the box for the same job, then ONS uses it to copy over information from the previous period. So it'd be interesting to look at this and see, in this case, particularly as we get the changes in the job classification and the job coding system, how that's been quantified. So I guess the answer to the question is yes, there are plans. We have no idea yet what to discover from this.
What about the other aspect of the question? Will we ever get to see? Do we ever even want to see the underlying job descriptions? I'm not aware that that's ever been offered to anybody.
I guess one opportunity, I mean, Rachel might know whether it's possible to find the original code. I guess this is not necessarily our speciality, but it would be interesting if that was available, to make it available to people like Mark to actually go through and do their own checking. I guess also when the automatic coding was brought in, I had assumed that they would also do it on previous years' information, which was hand coded, to get some sense of the accuracy. But I don't know if there's any reports, and maybe it'd be useful to see if we could dig out any reports that are on that and try and find out, because there's a lot of QA information which ONS does internally, but it doesn't necessarily publish because at the time it wasn't seen as being relevant. You know, ONS was producing aggregate statistics, and what the key users want to know is what was the difference in the aggregate statistics and how has the discontinuity in the aggregate statistics been managed? Whereas we're interested in the very detailed, one person's occupation has changed, what's happened to it?
Rachel, I can see your screen is frozen. Can you still hear us? Have you anything else you want to add to that section?
Yeah, sorry, I got trapped off for a few minutes there. It's something we could have a look into. I think for most surveys, I imagine the underlying kind of job descriptions don't tend to be released before they go into whatever coding tool is used. I think I've definitely seen some reports that you possibly already have as well around the 2007 period for ASHE on the when the SOC coding tool was introduced, but I can try and dig those out or see if there's any more information lying around that we can get for kind of the second SOC coding in the ASHE data.
Okay. And is it possible?
Sorry, Felix, you go.
So will it be possible to get the sort of original information typed in on the form added to the data set?
I think it would depend on. I don't think that's something that's generally released with survey data, but it's something I can look into and see. It might be that, something I have to check with the ASHE teams as to whether that information is retained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. At the recent conference that we presented at Data for Policy, there was a lot of interest in this in terms of different elements of the quality assurance. Perhaps, Felix, maybe you could give a wider discussion on some of the other elements that we're looking into. But the other thing, of course, is when will researchers get access to this data? When will they be able to have this data, which is documented, specified, quality assured? When will that become available for people to use?
Okay, so I guess Arusha and I are working through this. So essentially, we've blocked a number of types of issues based upon our discussions with the other academic colleagues and going through a review of papers. So essentially, there are specific questions about the meanings of some of the variables in there. So a lot of yes/no variables. And we're not entirely sure that the descriptions of those variables in the metadata matches up to the reality of those data. So that's our first starting point because it's relatively quick and straightforward, and that gives us a sense of understanding what's in the data. The second set of issues relate around the sampling because there are lots of different comments about what the sampling and response rate is on data set between sort of 50% and 85% of the 1% sample that they're aiming to achieve. There are also lots of uncertainties around the how the sample changed, and there's any information about the period when the sample was cut over those 2 years to try to reduce costs on this. And ONS did a lot of analytical work in terms of when ASHE came in, of trying to sort of see what was the impact of the new ASHE structure in terms of picking up low-paid individuals. So the second issue that we'll be looking at once we've gone through the initial just some basic question testing, we'll be trying to get a better sense of the sampling, the weighting information. Then we've got to QA the core questions themselves, and this is something where, unlike the sort of yes/no questions, which are relatively straightforward, say, okay, this is how accurate we think they are, or whether we think there might be different ways of specifying these questions. This is why we're trying to understand what's in the underlying hours and earnings data. And as Alex and Lucy know, that there's an awful lot of detective work to actually try and understand how comfortable we are about the quality of the answers we put in that and how people have responded to this data. And because we're trying to do this not to solve a particular research question, but to generally improve the quality of the data set for all others, then it's a slightly wider question than we're asking ourselves, because we can't ask ourselves directly, does this question matter for my research question? We're now saying, does this thing we found matter for the quality of the data set generally? And then I can't remember what the fourth section is after that. Arusha, can you remember?
The analytical issues.
No, okay, so then move on to the analytical odd things that people have found in the data in terms of it's not clear that there is an issue with the data itself, but that researchers have found interesting elements coming out of the data. But once we've done the QAing of the data, so the aim for this is we'd like to, by the end of October, have our initial documentation of the current version we've got, and some of the basic analysis and the sampling information done, and to circulate that documentation amongst groups to be able to for comment and feedback. So it'll go to our expert user groups initially, but the idea here is that as soon as we can sort of get each version of the data improved, then we'll be able to make it available in the SRS. That's subject to ONS's approval because we are getting additional data compared to the standard ASHE data set that's available in the SRS. So we've currently got one drop of the data which is more detailed than is currently available. So we'll be going through that, asking ONS to confirm that they're comfortable with the release now when we've documented this. But there's quite a lot of information to be found. I suppose a fair time of when this should be ready for the ASHE data set itself would be around the end of this year to get this fully documented. I think that sounds fair for the team. And that's just in terms of documenting about more data and a much clearer idea of some of these basic inconsistencies we know about in the data. And for the ASHE census linked work, that depends upon when we can get hold of the data. But if we do, then the current plan is to make that available for around April next year. Anyone want to add anything to that?
No, I just think it's worth sort of reiterating that this data will be available from sort of ONS's Secure Research Service, and we will sort of be advertising dates on our website if and when we know this data will be made available. I think what's interesting as well is this idea about sort of carrying out the analytical work, and we know we've got the quality assurance and data cleaning going on at one side, but we've also got the analytical side also going on. And I know Phan and Lucy, Alex have been undertaking a lot of work for the Low Pay Commission. I don't know if there's anything you can say about that, or whether you can sort of talk about any of your findings so far.
Who wants to do that? Phan?
You do it, Alex.
Okay, well, it's mainly Phan and Lucy have done all the work really, but essentially we've now done a briefing paper to the Low Pay Commission, which uses the initial ASHE data going back to 2004. And we wanted to start from basement level, trying to replicate and derive the hourly pay used by the Commission, see how that's composed, then take account of some methodological issues in trying to understand the incidence of low pay and also the proportion of jobs that are above low pay, or at least above still low paid, and then high paid jobs above 2/3 median earnings. And in doing so, we've looked at issues like rounding, which Felix has looked at before, but the Low Pay Commission uses a rounding methodology to identify who is roughly around and below the minimum wage. And we've spent some time showing how sensitive results can be to the method of rounding. We've looked at main jobs and other jobs, and we've got the definition for the distinction between the two, and we've shown that there's been a growth in second jobs and third and fourth and fifth jobs over time, and that they are more likely to be low paying jobs, but they still constitute a very small proportion of all jobs, about 2.5% by the end of the period. So we've looked at that. We've looked at the missingness of the hourly data, and that is something we're going back to the Low Pay Commission on shortly, because they have a second away day on October 15th. Here we wanted to see whether the missingness of hourly pay data is in any way linked to being the probability of being a low paid worker, and the answer is yes. So that's important for analytical purposes, because it means you can't just simply treat these cases as missing at random if you're interested in issues around low pay. And then we've also shown that the incidence of minimum wage jobs has risen over this period. That's not surprising, because the value of the minimum wage has risen quite rapidly relative to average earnings. But we've also showed the proportion of all jobs that are high paid, above 2/3 median, has been rising over time as well. How can that be? Well, the group in the middle, the jobs that are low paid but above the minimum wage, has actually been shrinking. And so we've got some very nice graphs showing that. So that briefing paper will appear on the website shortly, on our website, wagedynamics.com. And the next stage, which Phan has already started, is we're going to start to look at transitions. Transitions initially just between 2 consecutive years, and we'll be looking at the likelihood of low paid people leaving the minimum wage zone, and their likelihood of entering higher paid jobs, but also their likelihood of leaving ASHE and their likelihood of not providing pay data. So we're going to be looking at that at 2 time points, and then we're going to extend that. So we will look at people's wage growth over a longer period of time. But then that, of course, raises a whole bunch of new analytical questions around and the construction of longitudinal weights. So that gets into the more tricky area. And when we start doing that, we're going to be producing both policy and academic output, just really as a case study, as it were, to illustrate what you can do with the sorts of data that we're producing in understanding dynamics in and around low pay. And we're also going to do this on the new drop of the data to see whether things look the same or different. And we're going to try and extend the analysis backwards. So to before the period 2004. Ideally, we want to go back just before the introduction of the national minimum wage in the late 1990s, so that we've got a fairly long time frame. And having done all of that, there's one other thing we are very keen to do, which is understand the mechanisms by which people do or do not get wage hikes. And here, by mechanisms, we mean, do people get wage growth by staying in the same job over time? So that's returns to job tenure. What happens when they move jobs within the same employer? And then what happens when they shift employers? And they, of course, they can shift employers doing the same occupation. They can shift employers and do a different occupation. So we want to see what the roots out of low pay might be, and people might be interested in other attendant aspects of that, such as geographical mobility and the like. So that's where we're expecting to go in the long run. But that final step requires a bunch of things to be in place, whereby we can not only track individuals over time, but we can identify whether they are in the same or different job, and same or different employer, including same or different workplace.
And that was the missing thing I missed out of the QA. It is all perhaps fairly crucial to this is actually the longitudinal linking. So although we can simply sort of follow individuals over time, at the moment we're not sure about the links to organizations and definitely not the links between jobs. So that's going to be a crucial part of the QA, as well as building that longitudinal linkage over time.
I mean, we should also add that on the other analytical piece of work that we're currently doing, which John Forth is also involved in, is on ethnicity and pay. This is the link to the census. So the enrichment of the ASHE data with observed characteristics of individuals that don't appear in ASHE, but are actually really rather important for either social or economic reasons. Clearly, by definition, you can't do anything on ethnicity if you don't observe individuals' ethnicity. But when you have the census data, and if we discover that the census data matches of a reasonable quality, then that's precisely what we can do. And in addition, of course, through the census, we'll see one or two other things as well. Their actual educational attainment, aspects of family structure and the like, which we wouldn't observe purely with ASHE NES.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and the key to this project really is about providing this public good, making this data available for researchers, academics, for government departments, whoever, to get hold of this data and conduct their research and answer these policy relevant questions. Now, ASHE comes with a history of lots of people already using ASHE over periods of time. But if I was a new researcher, as an earlier career researcher or working in the government department, wanted to carry out analysis of this, could people from ONS sort of talk us through the process in which how I would get access, and maybe invite those who are working on the data, perhaps Lucy and Phan, to tell us something a bit about the challenges of working on the data?
Yes, I can start off on talking about accessing data. So there'll be kind of updates, as you said, I think you'll put on your website, and we'll have information going out through us and ADR UK when the data will be becoming available. In terms of accessing the SRS data, you have to submit a project application through a research accreditation panel that's independent of ONS, and they determine kind of the outcomes of these applications. We have a research for accreditation service, which is an online portal that you can register on, and through there you can apply to do accredited researcher training. So to access the SRS itself, you have to be an accredited researcher. And through our portal, you can access that training, sign up, and when completed, you can look at applying to use the data. You can submit applications through that portal to access the data sets, and then our teams will help you to kind of review that application and make sure that it's comprehensive and has the best chance of clearing the research accreditation panel. And once it's kind of gone through those processes, if it's been approved, we'll then get you access to the SRS and set you up to use the data there.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And over to the guys and actually sort of working with the data, accessing the data. If you were to give me any sort of tips, what would they be?
Do you want me to say something, Phan, or?
Yeah, you go first. Yeah.
I'll go first, then you can add. So I think, well, all data sets have their challenges. ASHE is no different. What I would really hope is that what we are doing will make a difference to people in the long run, because I think one of the hard things is when you come to the data and there's all different bits of documentation from different years, and I think it's a bit sometimes overwhelming to know where to start. To find your way, but I would say you really just have to get going with the data, play around with it, and then you discover all its quirks and unique features. And I think I would say just don't underestimate the amount of time it might take you to feel like you have got up to speed with the data before you can really get into looking at the research questions that you want to look at. I wouldn't underestimate the amount of time you might need to feel familiar with the data first. I guess that was my main point.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Phan?
Yeah, so basically the project, so we plan to have the documentations, like how we build the updated ASHE. So we will have the code ready there and the description there, so it make a bit easier for the researcher and clearer for them to catch up with the new updated version that we build in. So that is the plan. So instead of now like all document or user guides is everywhere over the years, so now we plan to put all in one document, and it's a bit clearer for you when you use it later. Okay. So that is our aim at the end.
I think we also asked about thinking about how we can add some summary statistics to the documentation as well, to make it easier to know how many individuals are there in these groups, how many people do we know, what's the number of missing values in the different data, some of this basic information which might help people to make decisions about whether the data is appropriate or not.
I think that's also that's also quite a nice first step when you're getting to grips with the data. If you can see someone else has produced those summary statistics, you can check that, oh, actually, I am getting the same thing. So therefore, that can help you understand a bit more that you're working with the variables you want to be working with and things like that.
Yeah. And we'll make that data code available as well. So for our code for this, we can make that available so people can see what we're doing and borrow from that.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. I think we're sort of out of time there. So just to let you guys know, if you want to know anything more about the project, wagedynamics.com, and any questions, send them through to us through that mechanism, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So,
Bye.